We begin today by talking about what is measurement in research. Measurement, we might think of this as being something we did in elementary school using rulers, but actually, why are we focusing an entire week of a research class on this? So for a couple of reasons. First off, variables, a term we haven't investigated closely yet, but this is what science is all about, and we have to be exactly clear ourselves about what we're studying, and measurement helps us with that. And we have a quantitative focus in our class, and in quantitative research, we measure variables so that we can run statistical analyses. So science equals measurement. We measure some variable of interest to see if it changes under some condition we apply. For example, a doctor has a new salve that she thinks will reduce the severity of a rash, so she must measure rash severity to see if it works. You can think about how she's going to do that. Is she going to measure the density of the spots on a person's body, or maybe the aggravation or redness of those spots? So you can see how she has to measure it. A pet owner hopes that his dog will learn to come to a whistle if he gives the dog a treat each time. So he must measure the dog's compliance to the whistle blow so he can compare. A shop owner thinks that customers will spend a little more money if he puts small items like gum right next to the cash register. So he must measure spending on these small items. Otherwise he won't know. A coach thinks his runners will have higher endurance if they eat a high-carb meal like spaghetti the night before a run, so she's got to measure runners' endurance. So all of these are ideas of why we have to measure. So what is a variable? You'll be familiar with this if you took statistics, which is an excellent prerequisite for this class, but if you haven't, this will explain this to you. A variable is any property or characteristic that can vary across a population, or, quote, a property of people or objects that takes on two or more values. So that word vary, spelled V-A-R-Y, means to change, as opposed to V-E-R-Y when we say like very much. So to vary means to change, so a characteristic that can change across a population or differ. So we can look at these humans, and in what ways do each of them differ? We could say they vary by height. They're all different heights. We could measure those. They vary by color. They're all different colors. They vary by sex. It looks like we have some male and some female bodies here. So in this case, height, color, and sex are the variables. The saguaro-cacti here vary by a number of things. We could measure their height. We could count how many arms they have, how many ridges each one has, how many spines each one has, what is their diameter at the base, and many other things. So those are the variables that a researcher might consider. If you look around you, you can probably identify variables yourself. So in psychology, we often measure psychological constructs. And social science is in fact a field where our variables are often invisible. We can't just count them like we have in the previous ideas. So think about biosciences. In biosciences, they measure specific measurable biological functions like heart rate, blood pressure, weight, things like that. Chemistry. They measure specific measurable components of matter like number of protons. Economics, they measure specific measurable indicators like income. But look at social science. We measure specific things, but they're invisible, like happiness, anxiety, student engagement. We can't put a thermometer or a ruler to any of these ideas to measure them. So that's why we call them invisible. We call these invisible ideas constructs, defined as way to describe patterns of behaviors so they can be explored. They consist of clusters of ideas that are bound together in some way that must be conceptually defined. For example, student engagement might consist of things like alertness, interest, involvement, and responsiveness. When all of these come together in some way, we can say that the construct student engagement is high. Again, we can't measure any of these things with a ruler, though, or a thermometer. More examples of constructs that we try to measure in psychology. We measure depression, gratitude, pro-social behavior, awe, need for cognition, need for affiliation, compassion, intolerance. How would you go about measuring any one of these? So a little bit more about constructs. Constructs generally consist of clusters of related ideas that converge around a common theme. So, for example, the construct self-concept might consist of self-schema, or the characteristics that you see yourself as having, the self you were in the past, your present self, who you are today, and your possible selves, or what your future might be. All of these combined together cluster under the idea of self-concept. In psychology, such constructs are often used as variables to be measured, about which some change is predicted. For example, a researcher studying Navajo identity coherence may wish to take some measure of self-concept to see if cultural teaching enhances its positivity. So let's just review your types of variables at this juncture. We talked about independent variables, what the researcher manipulates or does or treats the study's participants that he or she thinks will have an impact on the construct of interest. And then dependent variables, that is the construct of interest that's being measured. Or we might say what the researcher believes will depend on the independent variable. And we talked about these examples. The independent variable being the variable that's changed. In this case, what the researcher is interested in that they're going to manipulate is the amount of water, and they're interested in seeing that whether the health of the plant depends on the amount of water. They're going to measure the dependent variable, the size of plant, the number of leaves, whether it's living or dead, and we have talked about what other factors the researcher might need to control. Example 2, a human concept. What if we did the impact of cultural training on self-concept? And so we might have conditions, independent variable, in which some people were, let's say Navajo people, were randomly assigned to get teachings about their culture, and other people maybe had to wait to get those teachings or were assigned to something else, and then we measure in some way self-concept. And so then the IV is the cultural teaching that is manipulated by the researcher, and the DV is self-concept that's measured by the researcher. And again, we think the dependent variable will depend on the independent variable. So in this case, the DV, the health of the plant, depends on the amount of water. And in this case, the dependent variable, the self-concept, would depend on the cultural teaching. So the dependent variable is what is being measured. It's the variable of interest, something that's important enough to want the researcher wants it to change. It's the variable that may differ in different circumstances. So in different conditions, the plant growth differed. And it's the variable that's affected by some condition imposed by the researcher. And another example, the independent variable in this experiment, asking the question, are test scores impacted by the amount of time spent sleeping the night before a test? And so the experimenter is going to impose either sleep or no sleep on individuals, and then as the dependent variable, measure their test grade. This researcher thinks that the test grade will depend on the amount of sleep. So let's get back to measurement. Because the dependent variable is at the heart of a researcher's question, it's essential that the construct of interest be carefully defined and carefully measured. Carefully defined? Even though we think we know what we mean by a construct, we probably all have slightly different ideas. So it's important to define in simple language exactly what you mean when you use the word. Consider happiness. What do you mean? If we all wrote definitions, if we were in a classroom, the definitions would vary. Or what about aggression? Self-confidence. So it's important for the researcher to say exactly what he or she means. Secondly, carefully measured. Since we don't have a thermometer, it's really important to find some way to measure our constructs. This measurement might be done in a number of ways, and that's what we'll be focusing on this week.